those of us who are captive ratepayers are going to be paying a lot more for our power. What advice do you have for somebody who wants to do this? They want to get away, they want off the...
One is, Amy, I might correct you a little bit in the future. You may not pay more because it may not be available.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the PowerGab podcast, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman. My co-host Amy Cooke is in studio with me today. Before we kick it over to our special guest, I'm going to send it to Amy to sort of introduce the topic because it's a little bit different than what we usually do on the show. We're talking about a sort of a longer-lived topic related to self-generation.
Yeah, actually. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm actually really excited about this show. You guys know that I end every show with Get a Generator, especially as we have talked about the fragility of the grid, the high expense that is, well, the cost of electricity right now, plus what is going to happen in the future. Last week, we talked about the Fenberg Rider, the blank check to Xcel. And as much as I have disliked Xcel, and people who have known me for years know that I have railed on them, but they are really a creature of the legislature. And our guest today, there are two things that you should know about him. Well, actually, there's a bunch of things you should know about him. One is he's a retired state lawmaker, did 8 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate. He was one of my allies all the time on energy and environmental policy and in the Clean Power, what was it? The Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, House Bill 1365. He was one of the few, along with State Senator Lois Talktrop, Democrat out of Adams County, that fought against that. And what you're going to hear from our special guest, and I'll tell you his name in just a moment, but I want you to think, those of you who have known Colorado politics for a long time, this particular retired lawmaker is a quintessential Coloradan. Born here, entrepreneur, has backpacked across the Colorado mountains. And this is one of my favorite things about him, besides the fact that he is a raging free market conservative, is that he also has, and has been doing this for a long time. First person I knew in Colorado who did this, has built a house where he self-generates. He produces all of his own power right there at his house. We talked about it a little bit for those of you who remember my old radio show. He would come on my radio show every Monday during the legislative session. So if you don't know who it is by now, look up State Senator Kevin Lundberg, who I think he retired in 2018. Senator, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, Amy, it is great being with you again after a long hiatus, you might say. But yeah, now one clarification. I actually served for 10 years minus 5 days in the Senate, and for 6 years plus 5 days in the House.
Oh, wow.
And that's because I went over on a vacancy committee appointment. And because that slight less than a half a term, I was able to run for the state Senate twice. So I claim 10 years in the Senate. That I think makes me kind of the senior legislator around there. And did retire in 2018.
Yeah, you actually have seniority on the amount of time that you were there. I want to ask you. And you know
what it was worth? Nothing. As they used to say, 10 cents plus that gives you a cup of coffee, except it doesn't give you a cup of coffee anymore. So
no, not anymore.
$10 plus that gives you a cup of coffee.
One of the things we wanted to talk about today, because I talk about this all the time, and we both do on the show, is this fragility of the grid and the cost. And when you were down at the legislature, you were a reliable vote against the state mandating resources In other words, these constant increases in the renewable portfolio standard. And many people were surprised when they found out that you use wind and solar to power your own home. And I want to get to the philosophical part of why for more than 2 decades have you been powering your own home in Larimer County, which is the county that you represented in Larimer County. Why did you choose self-generation at a time when everybody just, we were all plugged into the centralized grid?
Well, I had been fascinated with it all my life, really. A bit of a tinkerer with things, and I wanted to build a house that was sustainable. And it had nothing to do with politics at the time. I realized it was a pretty handy background to have when you get into the give and take of things. But you're quite right. I am I'm a conservative across the board, but a fiscal hawk, I think you'd call me. I spent my last 2 years in the Joint Budget Committee, and boy, did I give them trouble there. But that's another program. Love to have it sometime. So when my wife and I were finally able to build a home, I said, look, let's make it self-sustaining as much as possible. So it's out in Larimer County. It's just west of the town of Berthoud. And it's bermed into the earth, super insulated, with everything facing the south, so you can, get the sun's rays in the wintertime, but the berming kind of cools you off in the summertime. So we don't need air conditioning, and we really need minimal heating too because of that. But I wanted to make it off the grid. And it wasn't really a survivalist perspective, which a lot of people, would like to accuse me of. It was just a fascination with the technology. And I saw it as kind of a grand experiment, you might say. And I had no idea that I'd ever be in the legislature at that time. I learned a lot through the process, not only on solar energy, but just dealing with the government. All the rules and regulations. And I found out that when I designed it, it was really solid. And when they said, no, you have to have an engineer do that, well, it was kind of barely on the edge. And, so I didn't gain a whole lot of respect for how the government thinks they've got to protect us all from ourselves when we're trying to build our own domicile. But solar and wind, I saw as a real key. And this was back in the early and mid 90s, and solar was just barely catching on. Panels were very expensive, like 20 times the cost per watt than what you can get today. And the inverters that you needed, there was one inverter that came in just a few years before we built that we're actually still working with today, because it was just a real solid one with all the features you needed. But prior to that, they had these square sine wave things that all of your electronic equipment would go berserk over. And so we were just on the cutting edge there of,
So,
no, let's call it the bleeding edge,
So,
because that's the way it was, and trial and error, you kind of learn what works, what doesn't.
how much? So when you raised kids in this house and everything, and how did you all view your power usage? So, in other words,
Well, within the context of a family, that's a very important question, because most of the homes that were solar powered back then were usually a couple of engineering type people. If it was a couple, they had no kids, and they would go to work someplace else, and so they'd come back and have to keep it at 65 degrees for 12 hours and then leave it in the wintertime, and the exact opposite in the summer. But we had a full family. Our third child was born in the house, and actually she's moving out next week. And I just told her about an hour ago. I said, you've become a bit of a fixture around here. We're going to miss you. But she was born in this, grew up in it, and has learned to work on it. But everybody in the house does have to live on an energy diet, or at least did back then. You can build a solar home today that, if you make it robust enough, that can pretty much run on electricity on almost everything. But back then it was much more difficult. And here's another thing. We are completely off the grid, as you described it, because that's about the only way you could really make it work well. They do have systems that interface with the utility. Unfortunately, if you don't have your own battery backup, if the utility goes down, so do you, because it needs the utility feed in order to run the inverter systems they have. And so a little bit of a practical thing, if you think that you're preparing this to be able to, maintain your lifestyle without the grid, you better look twice, look at it very hard, and make sure you've got a complete system that if it goes away, you can still flip the lights on.
Yeah.
That's an important tip. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, that raises an interesting question because, you mentioned you were sort of at the cutting edge or the bleeding edge, as you put it, when you were starting to experiment with this stuff. But over time, this has gotten to become much more of a hot topic, I think, in the energy space because people are seeing what the broader grid looks like, where policy is going. So now businesses and homeowners alike are considering doing something similar. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about some of the challenges in doing this over the many years and maybe some things you learned as technology changed, as policy changed.
Yeah, because my system is set up essentially to 1990s technology. And there you'd have one big inverter that would power either usually 24 or 48 volt battery systems. And then convert what you had into standard AC, 120 volt outlets. And 220 was just a little too much for that system. And also, here's another thing. I have about probably a mile of extra wire inside my house because I wired every room so I could run it off the DC side as well. Now, I found I really didn't need that. I thought I could save some energy usage because you do lose something in turning over to the inverter. But practically speaking, there's nothing available for 12 volts that really works well. Or I should say DC, because usually it is 12 volts as well for a vehicle, an RV or something like that. But with a household system like this, it's much more efficient to have a 24 or 48 volt battery system in, battery set up in series. Let's see, what was the question?
Just some lessons you learned as, technology obviously changed and the policy and attitudes changed.
Here's one thing that we picked up very quick because I wanted to make it run off wind and solar, thinking, well, when the clouds come and the storms come, we won't get much solar, but we are getting more wind then. And so, it seemed like a good mix. And it was sort of but I discovered that unless you're in a very high wind area, wind is really not very functional. And if it's too high a wind area, then it's completely destructive. And unfortunately, we had both of those sides. Where we live west of Berthoud, we don't get enough wind to really sustain wind generation much. But when they come in, man, they can be like a hurricane. And we put 3 wind generators on the roof initially. Oh, and I ran it past the engineers at NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory based in Golden. And the wind expert came back to me and he said, don't put those on your roof. It's a terrible idea. You just, he shows me all sorts of graphs on the turbulence and stuff. And I'm like, well, it's how I designed the house. And so I put them up there. But he was right that when wind comes there, it can, create sort of a vortex system on your roof and literally blow your wind generators apart. Wow. I returned one to the factory once, and they swore that thing had been hit by lightning, but it was just hit by big wind.
Right.
I mean, it just fried.
So what do you have? So you have solar, you have batteries, minimal wind. Do you have wind at all anymore? And then my other question is, what do you do when all of that is gone? Like when have you ever had a time where you needed backup to wind?
Absolutely. You said you're into your program with buy a generator. Buy 2 or 3 because one may break down and you may need another one. Yeah. And I don't know how many I have purchased because I had this one really big generator on order when we first built the house. And the thing was on back order for so many months that I finally said, just send me more solar panels and forget the generator. But, I thought I'll just buy a little, generator at Home Depot or something like that, which I did. And I discovered they're built to run about 200 hours and then they're done. They break, they fall apart. And I've got a whole yard full of them. Well, don't tell my wife it's in the yard, but but I ended up going with a big Army surplus diesel generator for a while because in the winter months you do need to supplement the energy. In Colorado, we have a lot of sunny days, but we have a lot of storms that come through too. And as I said, the wind didn't work well. I finally have one wind generator left on my roof, but I haven't used it for a few years because a big wind came and blew the tail off of it and blew the blades apart. And the family gets really bugged. They think a blade's going to come flying through the roof, which is a possibility. So we just haven't gone there. And instead, I do have a generator as a backup, and I actually ended up with a remote control propane generator, which is beautiful. It's nice and quiet, and all I have to do is just grab the little remote button and, point it out the window and it starts up and then it's not automatic. It's just when you need it, So it's intermittent, but in the winter we do have to use it from time to time.
So how many gallons? So you have to have obviously a large propane tank. I mean, living on having a house on the coast of North Carolina, places that have home generators, they usually have 500-gallon tanks for propane tanks, maybe more, just depending on the size of the home. And how much are you going through? How often are you using that? I guess the real question is, how much in the winter are you able to rely on your solar and batteries and then kick on the generator? What's that percentage like?
We will generally run the generator if it's a sunny day in the winter. Now, understand you don't get that much sunshine, but if we don't have heavy usage that day, we may not need the generator at all. If we do, we'll simply run it for an hour in the morning and then shut it off and it's done. And then at night, if it seems like the batteries need a little more juice, we may run it for another 30 minutes or an hour or so, but that's about it. If it's a day that's really cloudy and stormy and we've got to run the washing machine and other things. Well, for example, this little studio setup I've got here is all powered by the sun, the lights, the computers, the Wi-Fi, the whole thing. So we're not at a real minimal side. We've lived a normal life, essentially. I even have to put up with hair dryers, which really use a lot of power.
Curling irons, coffee pots.
Well, no, I don't like coffee, so no big deal. But a toaster oven, no, you figure out how to do that with. You mentioned propane. Propane is a heat source. We went for about 10 years without a furnace in this house, and I supplemented it with wood stove, and that helped. But finally had to make the family happy, and so now you can flip a switch and you can run a little more and heat into the house. But being super insulated, again, it doesn't need as much. As a matter of fact, my propane supplier, he would not. You rent a propane tank generally. You generally don't buy. I'd like to buy one, frankly, but he wouldn't give me more than a 250-gallon tank, which is really 180 gallons because they can only fill it about 80%. So that's pretty much it. And we'll have it filled about 2.5 times a year. And that's for all cooking needs, for the furnace, for the hot water, and for the generator. So it's I can't break it out this much for the generator or not, but I can tell you this, that I pay a whole lot less in utilities than anybody else does in the neighborhood.
I was just going to ask, you may not have run the numbers, but I was curious if you could estimate how much you probably saved over the years on utility bills, not having to make payments to big monopoly utilities for all this stuff.
roughly speaking, I tried to do that, and I figured it paid itself out a few years ago.
Wow.
Um, you know, and so yeah, it is kind of fun. I have to laugh because I was filling out a bank form the other day, and they said, and for the secondary uh, identification, just show us a utility bill, and I'm scratching my head saying, I don't have one of those. I've got to buy batteries now and then. Actually, I did have to. That's another story we can talk about a little later. But you have expenses in buying panels. Last year, we had a terrible windstorm that blew half of my panels off their racks and broke them. And so I had to buy some new panels. So, there were a couple $1,000 we had to spend there, but they should be good for another 20 years. So I'm not complaining too much.
So, Kevin, a couple of things. One is, especially as we know the cost of what, for instance, this legislature or the current party in control of the legislature is doing to what, future bills now, but in the future, we're going to be, those of us who are, captive ratepayers are going to be paying a lot more for our power. And we know that the recent FERC order is going to add about $1 trillion. That's going to be, it's going to get expensive. So if somebody wants to do what you did, you made an important point when you said, don't think just because you have solar panels on your garage or on your house, suddenly that when the power goes out or you don't feel like paying XL anymore, you've got power, because you need power for the inverter. What advice do you have for somebody who wants to do this? They want to get away, they want off the grid, and then I want to know best generators, stuff like that.
Okay, well, a couple of things there. One is, Amy, I might correct you a little bit in the future. You may not pay more because it may not be available.
Yeah. Okay, you're right. You're right. I actually did say it's going to be a luxury item.
They are that over the top absurd in shutting down coal-fired plants, in shutting down oil and gas, and in requiring so many other features to, their idea of a new economy based on this, simply say this false, very dangerous notion that somehow carbon dioxide is killing us all. No, it's quite the opposite. I'll put in a plug for a documentary called The Climate Conversation if you want some more details on that. The advice
for people.
Yeah, my first is do your homework. Check it out. And here's a good example. We were building a house, it took us several years. The first thing I did is I set up an inverter system for a little studio I had in the barn, video stuff, because I do that as well. And so I bought the inverter, I bought a few batteries and enough panels to just run a basic system, and I did that for a couple of years just to see how does it work. How does it not work? What works? What doesn't? All sorts of things. And then when I built the house, I set up some power systems there. Before I built the house, I just built a little storage building, and I set it up for for the off the grid electric system, and use that for power to run the house. The building the house. But I learned a lot about, again, what works, what doesn't work. So do your homework, do some experimenting. Don't rush into it, honestly. And understand that the reason the systems don't work without the utility, if you just got panels on the roof, and these are good, efficient systems. They create a lot of great power, frankly, but they've got usually they have little power inverters on each panel, and that requires the utility. The reason it has to be hooked up to the utility is it provides the base AC cycle system so that it's synchronized with the grid. Now, if you go ahead and set that system up, make sure that you can also add they have some lithium battery banks that are pretty decent for that sort of thing. Pricey too, but if you're set up with a battery power wall, I think Tesla calls theirs, and there are a lot of different manufacturers out there now. Oh, and here's one other thing: shop around. My daughter has a house in Milliken, and she set up her house, which is standard home on the grid, but she put panels up, and when she went and got some prices from some of the folks that are knocking on doors saying, we'll get you solar, she discovered that they were about twice as expensive as if she shopped around and found the best deal where she bought it as an investment, not as a, hey, the government will pay for it, don't worry about it. No, you pay for it eventually. It's just that they take the subsidies that came through. Oh, and I didn't build my house on off subsidies. I built it off the dollars that I earned, by the way. But do your homework. Make sure you know what's going to work for you in your area. Make sure you have enough sunlight for what you're needing. Make sure if you're going to rely on wind, or maybe you've got some water source that's going by that you could gain some power from, or something like that.
So do you have a favorite battery that well, you mentioned the Tesla Powerwall, but I don't know if there were some that you've actually looked into and said, this is a good one or anything. We're not doing advertising for it, but I just didn't know if there was,
right.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've got three basic types of battery. You've got your lead acid system that we're all familiar with in our cars, and what you need for, if you're going to go lead acid, is oh boy, what do they call it? It has thicker plates. It's for deep cycle batteries, because a car battery is not meant to be drained, but a solar home battery does get drained. That means pull it down below 50%, bring it back up. A deep cycle can give you maybe 100 if it's a high quality one, up to 500 cycles, and then they're dead. Well, if you're pulling that down every day, that's about 1.5 years and you're done.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it gets much more expensive than you think it is. And I found that out the hard way by buying battery after battery after battery. I eventually had, I think it was like 100 old dead batteries, because I, need to supplement it with more and more. Now there's another system that's come on more recently, which these power walls and things like that are, which is the lithium battery. They are very expensive, many, many thousands of dollars. However, you can get about 15,000 cycles out of them before they're done. However, there's another battery system that was developed by Thomas Edison. Yes, well over 100 years ago, called the nickel iron battery. And the manufacturing of those went out about 50, 60 years ago now. Long story on that, but basically there's one company in China that makes them, and I bought that because they have virtually unlimited cycle capacity. They'll tell you they'll do about 30,000 cycles, but that's really because after about that much time and usage, the cases break and other stuff malfunctions. But it's a different type of chemistry that doesn't degrade, because every other battery degrades as it's being used. They learned this in the the submarine world, where subs used to run on lead acid batteries, and they, believe me, they knew what the limits were. Anyway, the one downside with the lead or with the nickel iron is you do have to add water quite a bit to it. So every couple of months, I've got to pour about 20 gallons, well, no, about 10 gallons of water into my batteries. And that's a task. The lithium are pretty much goof-proof in that respect. But again, very sophisticated system that you can't do a whole lot of individual tinkering on. But with mine, works out pretty well. They're big, they're heavy, they're bulky. They don't work well in cars, but they certainly do the trick for me. And I've had them. I bought 2 batches. And that's the other thing, is if it's a lead acid, you can't swap out. If you've got a battery or a battery bank, a bank of batteries of like 10 batteries, and one of them goes dead, if you put a new battery in there, it'll go dead about the same time all the others do, because
wow.
the way they interact. But with the nickel iron, they actually don't degrade in that respect. I mean, you can abuse them enough that you ruin them, but it's really hard. They're very tough, durable.
Well, Senator, thank you so much. I think we've probably gone well over
Scratch
time,
the
but
surface.
it was such a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you. It's always fun. You know, maybe there's another time to dig a little deeper into it. I recommend people try it, and when the lights go out, I won't give you my address.